This podcast is rated E for explicit. On January 25th, Leaving Neverland was released on HBO and met with a whirlwind of controversy.
Reaction to that disturbing Michael Jackson documentary, Leaving Neverland. It focuses on two men who accused Jackson of abusing them when they were children, and Chris...
After watching all 4 hours of it twice, including Oprah Winfrey Presents After Neverland, listen, I needed a minute. And in that minute that became a year long, I thought deeply about how my own personal story intertwines with the mission Oprah has been on for many years, to enlighten the public about how sexual abuse plays out more accurately as sexual seduction. So I challenged 2 members of the board to watch all of it as well, and...
I did not want to watch this documentary.
They weren't all that excited.
And then I was like, okay, it's going to be it's like part 1 and part 2. I'm like, God.
I said the same thing, by the way. I was like, I'll watch it. And it was like, it's 4 hours.
I was like, no, I got to put my mind into this if I really want to watch this.
But they rose to the occasion, and what follows is part 1 of that conversation. You met me in the midst of many things. Shedding skin, sprout wings. Looking at life as a spiritual being through a human lens. Having conversations with God about so many things. This show is your invitation. The poet God is the conversation. After watching Leaving Neverland and the Oprah interview that follows it, I realized that the lens through which I see it would be informed by why I began watching the Oprah show 28 years ago. Those of you of a certain age might remember the promo.
Telephone lines are burning. Chop what you're doing, make sure you're turning. Oprah's on, you got to see this. Oprah's on, something you can't miss. 4 o'clock. Where's everyone gone? I know.
So here we go. This is the 28-year-long history that informs how I see Leaving Neverland. So where do we begin? This is how 4 p.m. changed everything. When I think about, what this journey has been, it's really, really remarkable. Taking that trip back down memory lane into, as an adult, revisiting what everything felt like, especially when I first moved to New York City as a 11-year-old and being terrified about everything that New York City was, from my 11-year-old island boy, mentality, and then coming into this inner city school and being kind of terrified about what that was going to be like, and being teased and, wanting to just be invisible. And I couldn't be invisible because every time I opened my mouth, it was this accent that just was a big target for bullies. But that was just kind of half of the story, because I was terrified to be there, but at the same time I was glad to be there because I was running from this past that I had no idea of how to kind of deal with, and didn't have any language for it, for what it was. It was just something that I was reliving every day, the memory of it, but not being able to talk about it. There was no room or space to talk about it. And so the reason why Oprah kind of became such a magical experience for me is because her show was the first show that I ever heard discuss child abuse, child molestation. And in fact, that word molestation, the first time I heard it ever was when Oprah said it. And so hearing her say it and describe what it was and being raped by her uncle, it was the first time where I kind of realized that this was the experience that I had on some level, and that it was very similar to what I was, what my secret was. And here it was, she was talking about it on television. And so that was a really powerful moment. And also seeing it discussed in a way that was outside of me, knowing that that experience happened to somebody else. It wasn't mine alone. Made me feel like maybe it wasn't my fault. And first of all, there's a name for it. Right. Just the fact that it's a name for it, because I never had a name for it, was a very powerful thing, because the only name for it that I had was my own, because it was part of my identity as an 11-year-old at that time. So to be able to look at it from a different point of view was just mind blowing for me, and I think that was the reason why I wanted to be there at 4:00 every day, because this was like a treasure chest for me. This show, because what else am I going to learn? About myself. Because I was learning stuff about myself. I was trying to find out who I was through this show. And so it's never stopped being that for me, and so that's why it has meant so much, because it's been an education in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it was a very defining moment for you. I mean,
Yeah.
One of the interesting things you just talked about was being an 11-year-old and running from your past, and it's like, how do you even have a past when you're 11 in a lot of ways, like you, I can barely, I probably was just starting to ride bikes miles from home at that point. And, also talking about that experience of transitioning from what I would assume is a smaller place where you grew up. Can you describe a little bit about that? Like, where you came from? Was it a small town? Was it close-knit community, small community? No matter what it was, going to a place like New York City is going to be a pretty big, shocking moment to the system, especially as a young person, even if you were already coming from another place in America.
Yeah, I talked about being there in New York City, but mentally, in many ways, I was still there in that moment of when the last time that I was molested occurred. And so the way when I think back on it, there was so many years that after that had happened that it felt like in order for me to be present, that I had to be thinking about that, because it was part of my consciousness. The very thought of it, just reliving it, was a part of my consciousness. And I, it was this constant tape, coming home from school, and this particular dude who was in a much higher class than I was in. He was a bully, and this particular day, it was just the custom of what we would do as kids. Is you come home from school and you go and you play, you get into mischief and so forth, and you always had your partners in crime. And so I was with one of my partners in crime, and we were just kind of hanging out behind my grandmother's house, and we saw him coming down the road, and I think he saw us kind of playing at the bottom of the hill, and he decided to engage himself in what we were doing. And we both kind of looked at each other like, he doesn't even talk to us. Like, why would he want to be involved?
And how old were you at this? Like, was this before?
I probably had to be like maybe 9.
Okay.
And he was he was a teenager. So Yeah, so that was the thing. It was like, why does he want to play with us?
Right.
You know, what is he trying to be in our little thing? And so we were just like looking at him like, okay, I guess. And the other thing was that he was being super friendly, and he's not. We didn't know him to be friendly.
What did you know him as? More as like a bully?
Well, he was a bully. He was
Yeah.
he was definitely a bully, and it was kind of like, you just want to steer clear of him in school because he's always the aggressor, and just kind of the one that you don't want to run into on the playground.
Yeah, the typical kind of
Yeah.
bully
So
character.
it was just interesting, and anyways, and so my friend who I was playing with, it was getting kind of late, and so he wanted to go home, and so I was gonna walk him home down the street, and the bully was still with us the whole time, and so he walked with us as I walked my friend home, and after I walked my friend home, he was like, "Oh, so what are you gonna do?" And I was like, "I'm gonna go home, back up the street to go home." And at the time, there was this building being built. It was like kind of halfway constructed. And he said, well, before you go home, let's just go in here and check out this place, And he took me into this building that was kind of like a 3-story building.
Yeah.
So it was a sizable building, but he took me into the building kind of off the road and off the beaten path where nobody couldn't kind of really see where we went. And I remember that at the time the sun was setting, so it was getting kind of dark. And, that's when he kind of like, started to, that's where, everything kind of occurred. And it's kind of like one of the things that I think back on, especially after watching Leaving Neverland, is when Oprah, talks to one of the guys, and she says that you feel complicit in it because you think, well, oh, I didn't have to go up here, like he didn't have a gun to my head, but
Right.
you went. Like, why did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about kind of that first experience when you and your friend were playing and you saw him coming and you were kind of skeptical of it. At this point, like after you had walked your friend home and you're just with this individual, were you still feeling skeptical? Did you did you guys have enough fun together that where you started to feel like, oh, maybe he isn't as bad as I thought he was? Or were you like still like, why is he still around? Why is he inviting me into this place? I'm just trying to get a sense of where you were mentally at that point.
I remember being skeptical the whole time.
Okay.
But because I wasn't alone, I was okay. Because, but then after we dropped him home, so to speak, and then he started to kind of try to steer me towards, a kind of isolated place, then I that's when I was kind of like, nervous, more even so.
Okay, so you did feel some sense of like
Oh, yeah.
nervousness and
Yeah. But I was also afraid of him.
skepticism and fear.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was afraid of him, so I didn't feel like I had a choice, So, because he was this kind of, he was kind of like a scary kind of figure to me at that point.
Right.
So I didn't feel like I had a choice to make I feel like I was, like I gotten myself in a situation and that I didn't know how I was going to, get out of it or
Right.
leave that space.
Relatively, like how old? You said he was a teenager, like 13,
Yeah, I think
14, 15, 16?
I think he probably had to be probably maybe 14
Okay.
at the time. But I think in my mind, because I was a small kid in comparison to him,
Right.
he was much bigger just in body and so forth.
Right.
And so physically speaking, there was no comparison between us in terms of me, but it wasn't the type of experience where it was like a violent thing either.
Right.
And so it was kind of even throughout the whole experience, it was more like a seduction than what people typically think,
Right.
happens.
Right.
And so there's that part, like I said, that you kind of feel like you participated, that you're complicit in everything that happened, and it's your fault, is what it comes down to. And then you, in a way, abuse yourself over and over again because of how you relive it, and the feelings that's associated with what you feel about yourself after, and what you feel about it. So it almost felt like the memory was worse than the actual experience.
Right.
Yeah. More with Aman and Gary when we return. Listen, I know you've been thinking about starting a podcast, and trust me, I am tired of hearing you think about it. And this ad is too short for me to explain telepathic abilities to you. But what I will tell you is that you can do it for free and be as cheap as you are and as cheap as you want to be. And Anchor has the tools for you to do so creatively. Now, as soon as you submit, your friends can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they prefer to listen to the shit. And you can make money on a little thing called listenership. So just get to it and download the free Anchor app, or go to anchor.fm to get started. My mother had met somebody new, and they were engaged to be married, and so she had me come up to New York to kind of begin this whole new life. So I was more than happy to go. Because I was running away from that experience. I didn't have to see him again.
Right.
I didn't have to see him in school. I didn't have to see him. I was, running away from that experience. But really and truly, that I couldn't run away from because I was reliving it every day. It was very much a part of my identity. So there was no running away from it.
So when it first happened, did you, after the moment or whatever, did you feel like, man, what, were you confused about what just happened to yourself? Were you wondering, because you talked about kind of feeling seduced, having that complacency or complicit, I should say. Were you feeling like he involved you in something? Would you feel like this trust in him, or was it more so the other side where I was skeptical going into this building, and after this happened to me, I became even more skeptical and fearful of this individual?
Oh, I was definitely more fearful of him.
Yeah.
It wasn't like this happened and I wanted to see him again.
Right.
No, he was a monster. Very much. He was very much a monster to me in the way that I experienced that whole situation. But this had been the third time in my life that I had been molested.
Okay.
By the time that happened. This situation with him was, it felt more traumatic, maybe because I was older. The other times I was much younger. And I think I just felt like, why do I keep attracting these kind of situations? And I was
a level of guilt almost.
Yeah. Why does this keep happening to me? That's the conversation that I was having with myself about it. Why does this keep happening? And the time, before, the first time it was with a female, so you kind of have this kind of thing where you don't know what to do with any of that really at that age.
How old were you think when the first time it happened?
I think I was probably about maybe seven, probably maybe 8 around that time. Okay. When that had happened the first time. So yeah, it was a lot, but it was nothing that I was able to deal with. There was no dealing with it. It happened, Yeah. And you live with it as much as a 9-year-old or a 7-year-old lives with anything.
Right, right. Was there a factor of fear as well in that experience? With the individual, were you skeptical of that individual? Were you scared of that individual? She was a monster. She was a monster too. She was molesting her brother as well.
and he had gotten tired, I guess, of it, and he threatened to tell their father because she was his, I believe she was his half sister.
Okay.
And so she wasn't somebody that was present in their home all the time. I think she would come to visit from wherever she was visiting from or whatever, and this would happen. And
was it like an adult or was it another teenager?
She was an adult. She
Okay.
was probably I would, because I remember her being much older than us. She probably was like 19
Right.
when we were, 8 and 9.
Yeah. And at that age, were you like, in looking at older people, whether it was an older teenager or someone who's like a young adult, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have kind of within yourself this understanding that they were an authority figure or that they were someone that you couldn't say no to? Like how did you like view people that were older than you at that point in your life? Do you recall by chance?
I had a lot of, I used to fight a lot in school. I had a lot of anger issues. And so I think some of that was because of this loss of control that I felt, especially in these situations in particular, and having somebody control you and dominate you in that sense, and me wanting to just rebel, I guess, for lack of a better word.
So that was kind of your outlet, was like kind of fighting.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And and not being able to have a place to speak about it, to express, everything that I was feeling about it. But also dealing with this, obviously being molested that early and before you even know yourself as a sexual being, having
Right.
that to deal with that way earlier than you should have to deal with it.
And not even having the vocabulary for it.
And not
right,
having-
too,
yeah,
'cause
and
you
not
also
having-
talked about that, like that word, hadn't even heard that word
Right.
yet.
So I think a lot was going on that I wasn't able to process, and we didn't exactly live in a place where there was anybody to help you with that. If you don't even have the language to say X, Y, and Z happened to me, how are you going to even begin to tell the story?
Correct, right.
So that's why, by the time I got out of there and had that moment at 4:00 with Oprah, it was like a light on a lot of things that I was trying to explain to myself, about all of these things that I was feeling and going through. So it was a massive moment.
Interesting. So it's like kind of going through these experiences, even though you were very young and even though you may not have had the words for it, you recognize within yourself and within it that it was something that made you feel a negative feeling. It wasn't something that you were like necessarily confused by, because I think one of the things we heard in this documentary was not because you're so young and because you're not, you haven't been told necessarily that X, Y, and Z is something that you should not be experiencing yet. Regardless of that, without that knowledge, you still felt, anger. You still may have felt kind of betrayal.
Right.
You talked about feeling this fear, and also like that third experience kind of made you wonder, like, why me, right? Like, I already went through this twice, and I didn't appreciate it those times, but yet I found myself in this situation again, and it was kind of, you talked about kind of being, it's small in stature, but then also probably, mentally feeling like these people are kind of taking advantage of that, and you're not able to fight back, not only physically but also mentally. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just like learning through this process.
Yeah, and I in between these moments of all of these times where these molestations that happen, there were people who had attempted to do things to me that weren't necessarily successful. There were people who kind of catcalling I had that experience more times than I can remember, just walking down the street, and also people doing strange things. Like I wrote a poem recently where I talked about this woman in church who used to fondle my ear, and she would sit behind me in the row behind me and just fondle my ear, and feeling disgusted by her and all of these people who were sitting around and not doing anything about it. People giving her strange looks like, why are you touching that child? But not actually doing anything about it.
Yeah, so more like matter-of-factly and dismissing it rather than being very clear that that was outside of the normal realm of behavior.
Mm-hmm. And so although, that somebody might define that as being molested, but it felt like that because it was somebody who was touching me in a way that I didn't want or welcome.
Right.
And except in that case, I was in church.
Right.
And nobody was doing anything about it.
Right, because you're kind of trying to take your cues from the society around you, from the adults around you. Right.
It's like, okay, is this acceptable? So she can just touch me? Okay.
Right.
That kind of way. Just weird things. A lot of weird things, happened. And you just kind of be like, okay, I guess this is what people do to children if they like them.
Right.
It's weird, but a lot of little things like that happen.
Interesting. So you're 11. You're in New York City. You're dealing with this crazy transition. You're afraid to open your mouth because people can hear your accent.
Right.
You're also reliving and running from these experiences that you've had in your past, right, as an 11-year-old, which is again very, very powerful to be thinking about. And then you turn on the TV and you see this show, and there's this topic.
And yeah, I mean, that was the beginning of me. I kind of jokingly say like my first day at Oprah University,
right?
And kind of discovering something that was so monumental in my life, and I stuck with it because all of those years I was learning about who I was, and I think it kept me from getting into a lot of trouble, because I think. One thing that we heard in Leaving Neverland and the show that Oprah did after is that a lot of times what happens to you at those early ages doesn't materialize until you start to grow older.
Right.
And you go into your teenage years, and then all of these things that you interact with other people, these relationships that you have, and these things trigger things, and you don't realize why you're feeling or acting in this particular way. And I, because of the Oprah show, had been very aware by the time I became a teenager about a lot of different things in relationship to child abuse and what it is and how it affects you as you grow up and become an adult. So I thought that I was, dealing with it. And it wasn't until I kind of became in my 20s that it really hit me that all of whatever those seeds that were planted as a child through those experiences really kind of came to me like a tsunami, and it was almost like this wave of depression and just pain that I just didn't see coming.
Yeah.
Because I thought that because of what I was able to work through with just having, dealing with watching the Oprah show, that I had dealt with it. I thought I was good.
Right.
And I wasn't even close to good.
Right. So it was like you were going through your teenage years, which at that point you're starting to become, reach puberty, past puberty. You've had this revelation of seeing something like the Oprah show, and you're learning about these words and these experiences, and you're recognizing
other people's stories,
and you're like, oh, I'm not alone in this, right?
And I had done a talk show in high school.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of the shows that we did was about child abuse, and we had other kids there talking about it, and I talked about it, and it was wonderful to be able to have a space to do that.
And you talked about your personal experience in that talk show? Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. And so I thought that was doing,
You were healing.
yeah, and I'm sure that it had some effect, but whatever it was that was there that needed to take its course hadn't taken its course yet, and that's why I kind of, the two guys who was on the documentary, how they talk about how things kind of played out in reference to their pain.
Yeah.
I could so relate to that. Because I was like, where is this coming from? And what is this? And why now? Like, and that's the thing. I think with certain things, you just don't come to that space or that marker until you're there.
Right.
You can't force it. Mm-hmm. You can't, whatever trauma that is, you'll deal with it when it's there.
Yep.
And you can't force that. It's just, it has to take its course. Something that was set in motion so long ago. Mm-hmm. You're not gonna be able to force whatever that is. It's one of, like the dude said, he'll be dealing with it for the rest of his life, and I believe it.
Yeah. I think that was one thing that was interesting to me. Just in talking about, not that we're at that point yet, but like talking about forgiveness or whatever it may be. Like people always want to say like, oh, can you get to that point? Can you cross that line? As if it's as simple as you get from one side of the table to the next. But the reality is, he talks about it being a road, right? And it's not something that road isn't just necessarily defined by, just a start and end point, as if it's a race, right?
Right.
Because roads can go in a lot of different directions, and a lot of times they may not even have an end to it. But it's about kind of picking up some of those pieces throughout it. And it sounds like, between that age of 11, when you first started to understand that other people experience these things, that it was bad, and it was may not have been, specifically your fault, quote unquote, right? There's still kind of there's this feeling of, okay, and now that I understand this, I'm starting this healing process as a teenager. Hey, I even was able to do this show with other people and talk about it,
right?
And you kind of you're at a kind of a high, right?
Right.
But then you got to this 20-year-old version of yourself, and now something kind of hit you as a tsunami, and all of a sudden you're in this depression. So yeah, maybe, I don't know, talk a little bit more about that part of it.
Yeah. So by the time November 20th, 2009 came around, 18 years after I first started watching the Oprah show, when Oprah announced that she was going to be, the upcoming season would be her final season, I was so grateful for everything that I had been exposed to from the show, and particularly because of my story of how I even started watching the show, and so I was like, oh my God, 18 years, and what a journey. And I wanted to, obviously the dream would be to be on the show, be in the audience before it would be all done. And I was like, well, it's not gonna happen. And I was like, I just have to kind of make peace with that, but be grateful that 18 years happened, that I absorbed what I could, and not I wasn't just a viewer, I was also a student in many ways. And I felt grateful that I got the message, And so I remember I watched that show, and then I just wept for everything that it was, and everything that it meant. And just, I didn't want to watch, by the time the final season came around, I didn't want to watch it with regret, in terms of like, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to ever get on the show. I just wanted to watch it with gratitude.
Yeah.
And so in order for me to watch it with gratitude, I had to let go of the fact that I was never ever going to be there. It wasn't going to happen.
When did you start to think like, man, this is something I want to be a part of? Was that early on?
I've been writing Oprah for years as a kid, and just as different shows affected me throughout the years, I would write letters and you know, I was always thrilled when they sent me a letter back.
Yeah.
You know, with the Oprah signature, and I even got autographed picture. And so those were definitely highlights through the years. Knowing that somebody was listening on the other side of those letters.
Yeah.
But so it's always been that desire,
There's a
to be a
desire
part.
there, right,
Yeah, to be a part
right.
of it in whatever way I could be. And so, you know, after 18 years, you know, you kind of, you know, it is what it is. You know, it's a popular show, like,
Right.
you know,
Right. It's tough. Yeah. Right. Right.
you know, so you kind of just have to accept that. But like I said, I didn't want to be in that space, and so I just kind of, you know, surrendered it. And so 4 months later, I think it was, I had seen an announcement on the website or the TV, I don't remember which one it was, where they were saying that if you are one of Oprah's ultimate viewers, that you could let them know why you are an ultimate viewer. And so I told that story that I just told you about how everything unfolded. And one of the producers called me. And
How did you tell it? Was it like a written letter, or did you record a video?
It was a
of
video.
yourself? Okay.
It was a video. And so I don't even remember what I said in that video. I don't remember what I said in that video, but you know, I just told the story about how everything started and what the show has meant to me after all of these years, and kind of went from there. And you know, the producer called and they interviewed me for the entire summer before the taping of 2010, that summer of 2010, before this show would begin in September. And so we taped in August, and throughout the whole interview process, like I said, they called me many times, and so they were thoroughly being very thorough with how they kind of did everything. And at the end of it, when the time got closer to when the taping would actually be, they said, well, you have, you know, there are 2 tickets and we're flying you out to a show. You know, and that's basically, there's not much more details, you know, than
Right.
that. So you have a ticket and you could choose whoever you want. So obviously, yeah, I chose my BFF, Gary. So he came with me to that show, and it was, my mind was blown.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe that it was happening. And we had a wonderful time. What do you remember from that time?
Well, what I wanted to say too is I think he forgot that I was the one that planted the idea in his head about to writing it to him, because I remember seeing the show and seeing the thing about the ultimate views, and I said, I don't know if he was watching it with me or I saw it first, and I said, I know how you're a big Oprah fan, so I said, you know what? I think this would be a good idea for you. Why don't you kind of do it?
Yeah.
In the beginning, he seemed to like brush it off.
Right.
And then I think like probably a couple weeks later, he informed me that he did something. So
Oh.
I wasn't aware that he had submitted something until
Right.
after the fact. So, and that's basically what happened. But the experience was a very interesting experience. Going to the airport and you see they have your names there.
Yeah.
A driver is there, pick you up in a car, drop you to the hotel. You get like the whole
First class.
Yeah, service, right?
Yeah. Surreal.
Exactly. So it was a great experience. Just actually just getting to Chicago, and then they were like, okay, the show is going to be tomorrow. So you basically get there the day before. You do whatever you want the day before. You can sightsee or whatever, and the next day was the show.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty incredible. You encouraged him to do this, even though like he had already kind of gone through this experience from when he first started to watch the show of like that engagement, right? You started writing letters. You were kind of, you grew up with it.
Yeah.
You know,
it was
you
very
grew up
much a
with
part
it.
of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Very much a part of my life. So, you know, to the next, so we flew in there, and we went to, when we got there, it was early in the afternoon, and then I think we went to Sears Tower, and some other places. And Chicago gets pretty cold
Very quickly.
very quickly. I remember being kind of shocked
Windy.
by how chilly it was.
So you guys were in Atlanta, flying from Atlanta?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this would have been late August.
Oh, so it was really hot.
No.
Here, in Atlanta, I mean.
Well, yeah, but not there. Not there. I was kind of surprised that the weather was that chilly at that time. I was really surprised by that. But yeah, we enjoyed the rest of the day, and then we were staying in Omni Hotel, so that was a very nice place. And it was so fun because for years, at the end of the Oprah show, you always see they play that Omni Hotel, the chime where she was dragging the wagon,
Right.
and then you would hear them doing the thing for Omni Hotel, and they would show the little picture of Omni Hotel where guests stay and so forth. And so seeing that, and every day for 18 years, and now you're here,
Right.
It's like, wow, it's unbelievable.
So this is the last season of Oprah.
This is the last season, and
yeah,
we were going to the premiere of the 25th season,
the first
the
episode,
very first episode.
Oh, we didn't know.
And we didn't know that though.
Because
We did not know that.
No.
They kept it secret.
well, we thought the premiere had already it was already, they were doing
Recorded.
promo, right. We thought it was already recorded.
Yeah.
Based on the timeline.
Correct. I got you.
So,
But I think the story is very interesting, right? Because you had this 18-year relationship with it. Mm-hmm. Once the announcement was made, you kind of had this moment of sadness, right? You were like disappointed a little bit, like
yeah.
you wept. You wept. I mean,
I did.
I'm just trying to like set the kind of the context of the stage, right? So you kind of had this realization that after writing a lot of letters, you weren't going to get to go on the show. You wanted to go on the show, like you wanted to kind of be experience it, right? Whether it was, I don't know if you wanted to be physically on the show on the stage or just in the audience or like whatever it may have been.
Yeah.
But you weren't able to. But you also were like, you kind of got to a point where you felt content. You were like, oh, you know what? I'm going to be all right. I'm going to enjoy the last season.
Yeah, because it wasn't, even the things that I was writing about over the years wasn't necessarily about being on the show. They were about how the show was affecting me.
Inspiring you and
exactly.
how you were consuming it and how it was making an impact on your life.
Right.
Exactly.
And so, obviously, Oprah has felt so much like family.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, oh, you want to go meet your aunt or somebody that you've looked up to and that's had this kind of influence and been responsible for bringing so much wonderful things into your life through the guests and so forth. And so, and how all of that has shaped you. So it was just really wanting to say thank you. And so I felt like, that this experience was her and the show and all those people who worked on that show for over the years basically saying that we hear you,
right,
and that you matter, and it was a very very validating kind of experience. But I was struggling to just be present, because I had surrendered this. Like, this wasn't going to happen.
Right.
So how am I
That's
here?
what I was kind of getting at, yeah.
How am I here? And so that was a beautiful experience. And the show was epic. Epic. We have to sit you down to see that premiere show one of these days, because I think we have it somewhere. Yeah. And so it was a wonderful show. John Travolta was on there. That was when Oprah announced that she was taking the audience to Australia. So we also found out that we were going to Australia.
One of Oprah's surprises, right?
Yes. One of the many. So it was an epic. I mean, I could not have asked for anything better than that. It was just...
That's pretty incredible, because I think also, one of the things you talked about in your adolescence, like before you moved and after you moved, was kind of feeling like marginalized, right? Like whether it was from not having someone to kind of be there to protect you when these things happen, not only like in the physical moments that they were happening, but also like not really having not the vocabulary or the outlet to speak to someone to kind of help you work through that stuff, right? You fought, you were smaller in stature, right? And then, fast forward 18 years after you first started having this experience growing up with Oprah, right? Like an aunt,
right?
Through the screen, right? And feeling that family member,
right?
Writing to that family member for a long time, getting things back. All of a sudden it's coming to a culmination, full circle to where you are seen, not only in the sense of them inviting you out to the show, but being in the audience, being part of the show. Again, I haven't seen it. I purposely wanted to give you space and having the ability to share it on your own time with me.
Right.
I never imagined that it would end up being something that was recorded, and I think that's also pretty humbling to learn about this during this process. But I think that's pretty incredible in going through that. Like you said, kind of coming full circle from where, to growing up and not feeling validated and, or seen,
to being invisible,
or heard, right?
And to have that be the end of the so-called journey in a way that,
right?
I mean, that was just it was life-changing. Right. I mean, really. I mean, I couldn't imagine that after 18 years that it could have become any more than what it was, but then it went to infinity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was just the beginning. That show was just the beginning because, we went through that experience. It was a wonderful experience. And we came back, to Atlanta, and I don't even think it was maybe 3 weeks later they called again. And they called again because they had recalled the original story of how and why I started watching the Oprah show. And it was because of that molestation story. And they were working on a show about 200 men who would come forward to talk about how what they experienced as boys and being molested as boys. And they asked me if I would be interested in participating in that. And I was, first of all, surprised that they were calling again. I couldn't imagine, why they would be calling again. And to have it be that felt more important than even the first episode. Yeah. And so it was like, yeah.
Interesting. So in the first episode, were you actually like a participant on the stage, or were you just in the audience?
No, we were in the audience.
Yeah. And then they announced the Australia trip. How long after that episode was recorded did you guys go on the Australia trip?
Oh, the Australia trip wasn't going to be until December.
So August is when you guys went and shot the show.
Right.
So about 4 months later.
Right. So that was the thing that we were looking forward to.
Right. So like you're sitting here looking forward to this Australia trip, and you get a call from Oprah's people again, like, hey, we wanted you to be part of this, incredible, impactful moment
that we're gonna,
which is part of all kinds of incredible, impactful moments on Oprah.
My God,
that inspired you throughout these years.
Yeah, and
wow, that's pretty.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And it felt like that show really is what was gonna. That felt more important than anything. And so, I had agreed to it, and I went out there, and this time I was alone, and it was a totally different experience. Totally different experience, because I had never had an experience where I was in a room with so many other people who I didn't have to explain my pain to.
Right.
Because they all knew what it was.
I felt it.
Yeah, and it was this energy, this incredible energy in the room I don't even know, and still to this day, I struggle to describe what it felt like, but it was an emotional moment that helped me to turn the page on that experience in my life in a way that I don't know what experience ever could. Be sure to check out 200 Heroes, a poem inspired by the landmark Oprah Show event I participated in about 200 male survivors of sexual abuse. We'll be right back after these messages.
Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had so many questions. Like, how do I record an episode? Where do I find background music? How do I get to show my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other places people like to listen? And where do I find advertisers? The answer to every one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is the one-stop shop for recording, hosting, distributing, and monetizing your podcast. And best of all, it's 100% free and 100% ridiculously easy to use. Personally, I like that Anchor allows me to focus on being creative while they handle all the less interesting details about producing a podcast. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. That's anchor.fm/start. I can't wait to hear your podcast.
When you were flying up there, though, like, what was your emotion and mindset? Like,
I
were
was
you nervous? Were you like really like anxious and ready for like?
Oh, I was
kind of ready to go, like kind of like somebody that's getting ready to play the biggest game of their career, and they're just like, man, I can't wait to get out there into that room. Or were you more like, oh, here comes this SAT test, and I'm really.
No,
I'm struggling with my math and my verbal, and I don't know if I want to take it. Like, where were you on that spectrum of emotions? Like, if you can try to recall it. This is before you get like you're on the airplane.
Yeah,
going there.
I was very emotional because it seems like this was time for everything that I had been dealing with and not dealing with.
Expressing, right?
Right. That it was time to
addressing, I should say.
Yeah, put it all on the table and walk into it as messy as it was gonna be, and do that in a way that I had never done before.
Right.
And I had never. The other thing too about what all of this did for me is that it gave me the permission to do it, which I never felt like I had before.
Right.
Because here it was, this program was being produced for the sake of empowering these men who had this experience and never were able to talk about it. And now you're saying that it's okay for us to talk about it.
Yeah.
So it's okay,
Yeah.
for us to talk about it. And so going into that space, it was like, oh my God, like there's so much that I hadn't given myself permission to express. And so even before those words of whatever those words were going to be, there was so many tears. The night at the hotel, I remember going down to an area where we had, dinner and so forth, where they had set up dinner for us and so forth. And many of the men who were going to be, on the show the next day were there, and we were at a table just talking to each other and kind of getting to know each other and so forth. And I don't think I stayed down there too long, and I just went back into the room and cried myself to sleep the whole night because it was just, I couldn't control it. It was almost like a dam was breaking, and this was, this was time. It was time.
Right.
And
it had been bottled up for so long,
and everything that I hadn't been, had the space to, now you have the space for it. And going back to the after the leaving Neverland thing, that's the same thing that she was doing for those two guys and everybody that was in that audience.
Yeah, that was powerful for me when I
giving them the space to tell their story without judgment and without these questions about, well, how could you let that happen?
Right.
Like all of these things that people say to people who go through things like these, and the blame and the cruelty of the questions they ask.
Right.
And all of that kind of stuff. It was, no, this is a loving, safe place for you to tell your story and not be judged.
Or not be put into a box, or like trying to oversimplify it. Because we've talked about that before. Everybody wants to kind of, as the outsider, they just want to get to like, well, why did you let it happen? Or what was it like? Or, all of that stuff. Instead of like taking that step back and saying, it's okay to talk about this. I'm not to kind of make you feel safe, right?
Right. And so that's what in many ways it was. It was a safe place to let it all out and to just exist in this with these other men who went through this you have this kind of shared history with, and it was such a, it's almost like the opposite of what in many ways being molested was. But just like how when you go through that experience as a child, you don't know what the seeds will be, you don't know how they will materialize later on in life.
Right.
And that's what that experience was for me. It was these seeds of healing that were planted that I couldn't know what it was going to be. And it wasn't until years later, I think the one of the producers had called me a few years later after that show, and just being on the phone with her and talking about what it had meant and what had happened in my life since then, just kind of stirred up some things. And I finally was able to, because I hadn't, and I write poetry and whatnot,
right.
And I hadn't written anything about that because I didn't have any words for it. And so when she called me, and she we had this long, wonderful conversation about what that experience was, it finally stirred everything up, and I was able to write a poem about it that kind of articulated in many ways what the experience was like. And I dedicated that poem to all the other men that were there, and the experience that it was, and that was kind of like putting a nice bow on it for me. I needed to do that because I needed to express what it meant in a way that I couldn't before, because it wasn't time for me to say,
You I didn't even know you needed it until it was, it was in that moment.
Yeah. And things, when things are ready, they happen, in the time that the healing will take place, in the time that it'll take, and you can't rush it. You can't, if you don't have the words for it now, that's fine. You'll have it when you have it. And I think, again, what she's done with creating these spaces for these people to say these things that are hard to say is important, because it's for them, it will be the beginning of that permission and that healing in order to start taking that journey for themselves that unfortunately society doesn't give you, and especially because it's surrounding somebody like Michael Jackson, that they're definitely not giving it to you,
right?
And so it means a lot. It meant everything, to have that experience. I'm Akil Johnson, the Poet God. Thank you for listening.